This is part two of the previous lecture, Texas 1980s to Modern Age. This kind of covers the rest of the political issues that have come up from the time period and also talks about groups, different marginalized groups, and how they begin to speak out and nationwide, but then how that really reflects in Texas itself. So let's go ahead and get started. So after Ann Richards becomes governor, she runs the next time against the son of H.W. Bush, George W. Bush. So I'm going to refer to him as W, and the other one is H.W. And who will later become president, right, in early 2000. And so he wins the governorship in 1994, and he wins re-election in 1998. The only reason he didn't serve the full one was because he became president in 2001 in the United States. Um, but essentially, he wins the presidency. He adds state testing. Yes, we can thank him for that to public schools in Texas. He reduces welfare spending, not like, not the amount of people that needed to be on welfare, but spending of it at least. And then during his governorship, which is a very popular governorship, Republicans won both the Texas Senate and the House majority um, at the Texas level. Okay, so even though it was a popular governorship, something the realities of Texas in 1998, it was the most rigorous, and I think maybe continues to be the most rigorous in the death penalties even today. First in the country of people without health insurance, third in the country of people living below the poverty line. And we see a large number of hate crimes. One in particular was James Byrd Jr. in the beating in East Texas. Republicans also win the lieutenant governorship, the attorney general, and the state comptroller. So this is a real turning point in 1994 in which we see Republicans really take control of power in Texas. So when George H.W. Bush does become president in 2000 itself, he goes against Al Gore, which was a really interesting election. Al Gore was the vice president under the very popular presidency of Clinton, and most people expected him to win, although Ralph Nader was a Green Party candidate, and he took quite a few votes away from Al Gore, which arguably lost the election for him. But the election in Florida was a contested one that went to the Supreme Court. And it was because of the way that the ballots were counted. It was like a hole punch, and not all the hole punches were readable. It was called the hanging chad. But when the Supreme Court ruled that the Florida counting would count and would keep, Al Gore acquiesced and accepted that George W. Bush became president, which is, was big turning point in history, obviously, because the very next year was 9/11, which significantly changed America a lot. And we can still feel those effects really today. We also know that George W. Bush brings his idea of state testing into the national spotlight, calling the No Child Left Behind high stakes testing. And so, super unpopular. Most states have actually let go of these high stakes testing, with the exception of Texas and other places. We also know that we continue to see the, Republicans, take control, social conservatism really take control of Texas politics in general. Rick Perry, who later became the Secretary of Energy under Trump, became governor because he was lieutenant governor, but he's reelected 3 more times. Drastic cuts to education. And he identified, along with other modern Texas Republicans, with the Tea Party. Greg Abbott became president-governor a little bit later on. He was reelected in 2018 and 2022. His term is up in 2027. He is the first governor that is disabled. He's a paraplegic. And he went in 2008, after Obama was elected, he was well known for saying, "I go to office, I see Barack Obama, and I go home." So that just pretty much sets the tone for how they govern. So this is an idea of the breakout of modern day, the way the cultural diversity and social diversity of Texas right now. As you can see, whites are no longer the majority, and almost completely caught up to them are people of Hispanic descent, Latina descent, And even though they're not surpassing whites according to the census data, we do know that they may also fall under this other race category as well, or the mixed race. And so every group has increased with the exception of white. So it's interesting to see how that's going to really possibly change things in the future. Okay, so the next couple things I'm going to talk about the American Indian movement and also the gay rights liberation movement. Now, these start to take place in the 70s, so I wanted to give you a little bit of context to what happened, like where this really began and what the status of it is within Texas itself. So the American Indian movement was actually founded in 1968. It was modeled very closely to the Black Power movement, this sort of cultural pride, and to bring to light the concerns, especially the poverty, very similar again to the Black Power movement. Because if we think about this, American Indians had the lowest income, the worst health care, the highest suicide rate, the shortest life expectancy, the highest unemployment rate of any other minority group in the United States in the 1960s. Native American minority groups, the activists, they tried to draw attention to these conditions. They sued the federal government to demand their own Indian autonomy in return of their Indian lands. In 1969, 78 Indians occupied Alcatraz, which of course was a former prison, kind of an island off of San Francisco. 1972, they also occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs in D.C. In 1973, 200 armed AIM, and they're nicknamed AIM members, took control of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which was the site in 1890 of the Wounded Knee massacre. So a pretty not passive group, but pretty militant group, wanted to draw a lot of attention. They do gain quite a bit of attention and do gain back quite a bit of rights and lands and autonomy and federal government recognition of them belonging to their own nations, which will empower them to do gaming, to allow them to do gaming and earn money and try to come up from that poverty level. And so you can see from this map that I've got here the states that allow gaming for Indians. Because the U.S. laws, they recognize certain form of tribal sovereignty now, thanks to the American Indian movement and other things, and self-government. Native-owned casinos have some immunity to federal government regulation, some of it. Some tribal gaming operations, they have to comply with Indian gaming regulations in Texas in 1987, 1988, and federal one. So if there's not gaming allowed in the state, they're not going to be able to do that. But we do know that in Texas we have gaming. However, let's talk about that here. So in Texas themselves, not all Native American groups were recognized by the federal government, and many times they had to fight to gain this recognition and this autonomy. One of those groups is the Tiguas, they were a group kind of stemmed from the Pueblos, so part of the Pueblo Revolt. So they were in West Texas, far West Texas, El Paso region. El Paso officials reached out to the federal government to say that they couldn't pay their property taxes. They were, and asked them to be recognized. And so they did earn their tax exemption, but the state insisted on being the guardians of their money. In 1984, the state attorney general at the time said that the Native Americans needed to adhere to the laws just like any other Texas and pay taxes. The Tiguas appealed to the federal government and they won their own federal protected status. They didn't have to be wards of the state anymore. They did agree not to do gaming because at that time we hadn't had gaming. But when Ann Richards became governor, she instituted gaming. So then the Tiguas created a gaming system in El Paso, and it was quite important to the El Paso economy, actually. It employed like 800 people, mostly of Native American descent, but other descents as well. And by 1999, their casino was pulling $60 million a year, so it made a lot of money. But John Cornyn, who's actually one of the Texas senators in U.S. Senate today, he was then the state attorney general. He said it violated the 1987 trust and forced them to shut it down. So they lost out, and that's the status of the Tiguas. So the other movement that I want to talk about is the LGBTQ movement, known as the Gay Liberation Movement, that started in the late 60s. And it really stems from the Stonewall riots, which many of you may or may not know about, in New York City in 1969. The Gay Liberation Front, GLF, formed shortly after that, and then they had a pride parade beginning in 1970. Here's a picture of that here, in that point forward. And we know that, by the way, when we're talking about this, we know that cultural diversity in Texas does not just exclude to race, but it also is inclusive to sexual identity as well. And that's why we're focusing on this too. Larger Texas cities are very active in this movement. In particular, Houston has a large gay population. San Antonio does as well. As a matter of fact, the area around San Antonio College is named the Gayborhood, right? We've got a strong presence around the San Antonio College community. But in Houston, they formed something known as the Gay Political Caucus. They addressed the AIDS crisis that come up in the 1980s and the inequities and discrimination that stemmed from that. The inequitable treatment of police, the brutality that many groups face, and specifically there were sodomy laws in Texas and in other states, but in Texas they were actually enforcing the sodomy laws. And this happened several times. There was one couple in Snyder, Texas, that was arrested 3 times for sodomy. So that made them habitual offenders, and they got a life sentence on the third conviction. In Houston in 2002, they arrested John Lawrence and Tyron Garner, and this is a picture. No, I thought I had a picture up there. I don't. I'm sorry. But anyway, they challenged this arrest, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in 2003, in a 6-3 vote, the SCOTUS overturned not only Texas sodomy laws, but the sodomy laws all throughout the United States, and said that that violated their personal freedoms and personal rights. Also in Houston in 2009, Annise Parker became the first openly gay mayor in a Texas city. And of course, in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled they legalized same-sex marriage, which still stands today. Okay, so now we're going to shift and talk about the changing economy in Texas to modern day times. And so we can't think about Texas without knowing that Texas is an epicenter for energy and the energy, issues. And so in mid-1980s, like I mentioned in the last lecture, there was a crash in the oil market in Texas. And this came because the Arab-Israeli crisis was over by 1980, well, in the mid-1980s, really. And so that caused demand for Texas oil to drop. And the problem with that is that several other industries dropped as well. And I will talk about the savings and loan issue here in the last slide as well. But it does cause a large number of bank failures, savings and loan failures, which I'll talk about, then in the real estate market to somewhat collapse. There were other economies that were sprouting up, though. People began to realize when the oil economy was dropping in the 1980s that they can't put all their eggs in one basket, right? They needed to make sure that diversification was important to the Texas economy. We can't bank on one thing for the Texas economy itself. So the computer industry, specifically Austin, becomes an epicenter of growth of technology. The airline industry grows. DFW becomes the center, the hub for American Airlines, and I think that was in the 1980s. Can't remember the exact year. Also in the 2000s, Continental Airlines, which was headquartered in Houston, merges with United Airlines. That's what my husband used to fly with, and he was part of that merger as well. And so even though Houston is not their hub, or not their main center, it's still a big hub for United Airlines as well. So we have an airline industry, and of course Southwest Airlines too. All of those airlines has created quite a bit of benefit to Texas itself. The other thing that really increases in Texas is our tourism industry. San Antonio, #1 tourist destination in all of Texas, and that was attributed to the Riverwalk, mostly the Alamo as well, and also our various theme parks, Fiesta Texas, which used to be called Six Flags, SeaWorld, and places like that. So let's talk specifically about Texas Energy in particular. So ERCOT, right? That's a bad word now, right? Because of this is, things that I read sometimes they come, of course, before the ERCOT issue and the Snowvid that happened. Was that 2021? I'm like trying to forget it, right? But ERCOT stands for Electrical Reliability Council, and they're the ones that manage our grid. And I'll talk about our grid here in just a minute. But the other thing that really is a big deal, and this also affected San Antonio College, was that they needed to find ways to find better drilling methods, right, in Texas. And so one of the most controversial one is one that's called fracking, which is called hydraulic fracturing. And I gave I gave a link here which you can click on. You can go to the U.S. Geological Survey and they explain this process in more scientific terms than I'm able to. So I just put a quote up here: the process of injecting water, sand, and other chemicals into a well to break up underground bedrock and free up oil and gas reserve. What does that cause? Earthquakes, right? In San Antonio College, I was teaching a class last year. It's the last semester. It might have been last semester, and there was an earthquake, right, that happened. We had a small magnitude earthquake, but that comes from fracking. So there's lots of environmental concerns that come along with fracking. The other thing is, why are we on our own grid system, right? That's crazy. Why is the rest of the country, what we broke down? We have this ERCOT organization where most people aren't even from Texas. But essentially it stems from FDR creating something during the Great Depression known as Federal Power Act, which charged the federal government with overseeing interstate electricity sales. Of course, we know Texas doesn't want anything to do with the federal government. It's very opposed to that, and so they didn't want them to cross state lines. Texas avoided that by creating their own grid, and we saw that what happened with that later on, right? Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about in this is some of the big corporate scandals that were a big part of Texas in the 1980s and 2000s. Two of the biggest ones, like I mentioned before, was the savings and loans collapse. Basically, that when the main regulator, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, was abolished, after this whole issue. But why this happened to begin with at all was because Reagan administration, one of the big things that he does in the 1980s is deregulate, right? And to make it better for corporations to expand. Well, this has a repercussion. If you're not regulating, then you're not watching what they're doing. And so they made a bunch of very risky things. And so we saw what had happened in the Great Depression when banks were making risky investments. And that's exactly what happened. Texas was the one that was hit the hardest out of any state because of the saving and loan scandal. 40% of all bank failures were in Texas. And guess who bailed them out? The taxpayers. Okay, the other big thing was the Enron scandal. And Enron itself formed in 1986. They boasted $100 billion in annual revenues, but it was pretty obvious that they had inflated their numbers. And by the time they realized this and realized that these were inflated numbers and everything, the Texas teacher retirement system, the employee retirement system, like what I'm on to get my own retirement, lost $60 million in stocks and bonds. And that's just some people that lost money because of the Enron scandal. And so they were convicted of crimes, as were several other people. There's lots of clips, and I'll put a shortest clip I can find on the Enron scandal. It's kind of a complex thing. All right, so that is it. We are done with all the content. That's where I'm going to bring you with Texas history. Hopefully you've learned a lot, and I hope you guys have a great day.